It was the first day of second grade at Westwood Elementary, and the buzz of excitement hummed through the halls like a beehive. Jake Porter, an 8-year-old with sandy blonde hair and a mischievous smile, clung nervously to his backpack. His mother, Susan, kissed the top of his head before releasing him to the swarm of children entering the building. "You'll do great, Jake. Just be yourself," Susan said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She squeezed his hand for a moment before standing back, watching him shuffle into the crowd. Jake didn't want to be just himself. Being himself was awkward and sometimes quiet, but it was the only option he had. His family had just moved to this new town, far from the familiar faces he'd grown up with, and now here he was, starting over at a school where everyone already seemed to know each other. He tried to bury his nerves under his favorite dinosaur t-shirt, hoping it would bring him the courage he needed. Inside the classroom, brightly colored posters filled the walls and desks were arranged in neat rows. His teacher, Mrs. Thompson, a kind-looking woman in her early 40s with short dark hair, smiled as she welcomed each student. She was gentle, but even her warmth couldn't shake Jake's nervousness. As he scanned the room for an empty seat, his eyes landed on a boy sitting alone near the window. The boy had dark, curly hair and skin the color of warm caramel. He sat quietly, staring out at the playground, seemingly as lost in thought as Jake felt. There were a few empty desks around him, but the other kids seemed to gravitate toward each other, avoiding the boy by the window. With a deep breath, Jake walked over to the desk beside the boy and sat down. The other kids glanced at him but quickly resumed their conversations, as though nothing unusual had happened. "Hey," Jake said quietly, trying to muster the courage to speak. The boy looked over, his dark eyes curious but cautious. "Hey," the boy replied, his voice barely audible. He fiddled with the edge of his notebook, seemingly unsure whether to make eye contact. "I'm Jake. It's my first day here," Jake said, offering a small smile. The boy hesitated before responding. "I'm Aiden. I've been here since kindergarten." Jake nodded. "Cool." For a moment, silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They were just two boys, both feeling like outsiders in their own ways. As the morning passed, Jake and Aiden exchanged glances during Mrs. Thompson's lessons. During recess, when Jake spotted Aiden sitting alone on the playground bench, he walked over and sat next to him. "You don't play tag or anything?" Jake asked, watching the other kids run around the playground. Aiden shrugged. "I guess. Sometimes." Jake glanced at the group of boys and girls already divided into their own cliques, laughing and shouting. He didn't feel like running after them either. "You want to play in the sandbox instead?" Jake asked. Aiden looked at him, his eyes brightening just a little. "Sure." And just like that, their friendship began. The two boys spent the rest of recess building castles and talking about their favorite video games and dinosaurs. It was easy, almost natural, as if they'd known each other for much longer than a day. They didn't need to say much, the companionship was enough. At the end of the day, Jake couldn't wait to tell his parents about Aiden. During the car ride home, he bounced in the back seat as Susan drove, recounting every detail of his first day. "There's this kid in my class named Aiden, and we built a huge castle in the sandbox. He's super cool, Mom. Can he come over to play sometime?" Jake's voice was filled with excitement, a stark contrast to his earlier nervousness. Susan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, smiling as she listened. "That's great, honey. It's nice that you've made a friend already." "Yeah, so can he come over?" "Maybe this weekend," Jake persisted. Susan hesitated. "We'll have to talk to your dad about it, but sure, maybe." Jake didn't notice the brief pause in her response or the look of uncertainty that crossed her face. He was too caught up in his newfound excitement. When they arrived home, Jake rushed into the house, still bubbling over with stories of his new friend. His father, Tom, was sitting in the living room, engrossed in a work email on his tablet. Tom was a tall, stern man with sharp features and a crisp shirt that never seemed to wrinkle. He looked up from his tablet, smiling faintly as Jake bounded into the room. "Hey, sport, how was your first day?" Tom asked, setting his tablet aside. "It was awesome. I made a new friend and his name is Aiden. He's really cool." "Can he come over to play this weekend?" Jake asked, his face bright with enthusiasm. Tom glanced at Susan, who stood in the doorway with a subtle tension in her posture. There was a flicker of something in Tom's eyes, hesitation, maybe, but it passed so quickly that Jake didn't notice. "We'll see," Tom replied, his voice measured. "Why don't we talk about it later?" Jake's face fell slightly, but he nodded. "Okay." Later that night, after Jake had gone to bed, Tom and Susan sat together in the kitchen, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. "So Jake made a new friend," Tom began, stirring sugar into his coffee. His tone was neutral, but there was a trace of something unsaid lingering beneath his words. "Yes," Susan replied, her voice tight. "He's different." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Susan sighed, leaning back in her chair. "He's black, Tom. I saw him when I picked Jake up. He's a sweet kid, but well, you know how people are." Tom set down his spoon, his expression hardening. "What are you trying to say, Susan? Are you worried about Jake being friends with a black kid?" "No, that's not what I'm saying," Susan protested, though her words came out too quickly. "It's just people talk. You know how it is around here. The neighbors, the school parents, they notice things. I just don't want Jake to get caught up in something he doesn't understand." Tom crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "Caught up in what? It's just a playdate, Susan. They're kids." Susan sighed again, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I know, but the world isn't as simple as that. People make judgments, even if we don't. We have to think about the kind of attention this could bring." Tom leaned back, his face tightening in thought. He wasn't a racist man, or at least he didn't see himself that way. He prided himself on being open-minded, on judging people by their character, not their skin color. But there was a nagging feeling deep down that Susan had a point. Their neighborhood, while outwardly progressive, wasn't immune to whispers and gossip. "We'll see how it goes," Tom finally said, his tone more reserved than before. "Maybe it'll blow over." Susan nodded, though the unease between them lingered. Across town, Aiden sat at the dinner table with his parents, Marcus and Jada. Their home was filled with the sounds of jazz playing softly in the background and the scent of Jada's homemade lasagna wafting from the kitchen. Marcus, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor, was cutting into his meal while Jada, always lively, chatted with Aiden about his day. "So how was school, honey?" Jada asked, smiling as she poured a glass of water for her son. "It was good. I made a new friend," Aiden said, his voice quiet but happy. "Oh yeah? What's his name?" Marcus asked, glancing up from his plate. "His name's Jake. He's new," too, Aiden replied. "We played in the sandbox at recess. He's really nice." Jada beamed, reaching over to ruffle Aiden's hair. "That's great, sweetheart. I'm glad you found a friend on the first day." Marcus nodded, though his expression was more thoughtful. "What's Jake like?" Aiden shrugged. "He's cool. We talked about dinosaurs. He said I can come over to his house this weekend." Jada and Marcus exchanged a quick glance, both reading the unspoken question in each other's eyes. Jada's smile faded just a bit, and Marcus cleared his throat before speaking. "That's nice," Marcus said carefully. "But you know, sometimes people's parents aren't like us. They might not understand." Aiden looked up, confused. "Understand what?" Jada took a deep breath. "Well, honey, sometimes people, especially grown-ups, have different ideas about people who look like us. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it's something we deal with." Aiden's brow furrowed. "Jake doesn't care what I look like. He's my friend." Jada smiled softly, her heart aching a little. "I'm sure Jake is a wonderful friend, but it's not always about the kids, sweetie. Sometimes it's the adults." Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "We just want you to be prepared, Aiden. In case anything happens, you let us know, okay?" Aiden nodded, though he didn't quite understand. To him, friendship was simple. He didn't see why his parents were so worried. Jake was nice, and that's all that mattered. By the time Saturday rolled around, Jake was bouncing off the walls with excitement. Aiden was coming over for their first playdate, and he couldn't wait to show him his dinosaur toys and his treehouse in the backyard. Susan, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. She had tried to relax, reminding herself that this was just two boys having fun. But the nagging voice in the back of her mind wouldn't quiet. What would the neighbors think if they saw Aiden in their yard? Would there be whispers at the next PTA meeting? Would Jake's social standing be affected by this friendship? She shook the thoughts away as the doorbell rang, signaling Aiden's arrival. She plastered on a smile and opened the door to find Jada and Aiden standing on the porch. "Hi, Mrs. Porter," Jada said warmly, extending a hand. "I'm Jada, Aiden's mom." Susan shook her hand, her smile faltering just a little. "Nice to meet you, Jada. Aiden, come on in. Jake's been waiting for you all morning." Aiden smiled shyly as he stepped inside, glancing around the pristine living room. Jada gave him a quick hug before waving goodbye. "Have fun, sweetie. I'll pick you up in a couple of hours." As the door closed behind her, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Susan tried to ignore the tension, guiding Aiden toward the backyard where Jake was already waiting. For the next hour, the boys played happily in the yard, oblivious to the unease lingering just beneath the surface. But Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She caught herself glancing out the window more often than necessary, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite name. Then, just as the boys were laughing about some dinosaur game they'd made up, Susan heard a voice from across the street. "Hey, Susan," it was Mrs. Anderson, her neighbor, walking her dog. She waved cheerfully, but her eyes lingered just a little too long on Aiden. Susan waved back, her stomach tightening. There it was, the first flicker of judgment she had been dreading. The days following Aiden's playdate at Jake's house seemed uneventful on the surface, but Susan's unease only grew. She kept thinking about Mrs. Anderson's lingering look when she saw Aiden in their yard. It gnawed at her, a subtle worry that something bigger was brewing beneath the surface. At breakfast one morning, she watched Jake and Tom eating, her mind racing. Jake had been talking non-stop about Aiden since the playdate. It was clear that their friendship was blossoming, but the more Jake talked, the more Susan's worry deepened. "Mom, can Aiden come over again this weekend?" Jake asked, his voice filled with excitement. "He says he wants to show me his favorite video game, and maybe we could even sleep over." Tom, sitting across the table, glanced at Susan. She felt the unspoken tension in his gaze, knowing he was leaving the decision up to her. After all, it wasn't just about the boys, it was about what the neighborhood might think. "We'll see," Susan replied, trying to smile but failing to hide the hesitation in her voice. Jake frowned. "Why do you always say that? He's my best friend now. Why can't he come over?" Tom cleared his throat, setting his coffee cup down a little too hard. "It's not that simple, Jake. Sometimes things ... aren't as easy as they seem." Jake's brow furrowed. "Why not? It's just playing video games. What's the big deal?" Susan exchanged a glance with Tom. They both knew that explaining the complexities of racial tension to an 8-year-old wasn't going to be easy, but the pressure was building. They couldn't keep brushing it aside. After breakfast, Tom pulled Susan aside. "We need to talk about this, Susan. Jake doesn't understand, and we're not doing him any favors by pretending everything is normal." Susan sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, but what do we even say to him? Hey, Jake, your friend's black, and that's going to make things complicated. That's not how I want him to see the world." Tom nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "We don't want him to see the world that way, but the truth is, other people do. The last thing I want is for Jake to get caught up in something he doesn't understand. We're just trying to protect him." Susan frowned. "Are we protecting him ... or ourselves? It's not like Aiden is the problem. It's just the way people look at it." Tom leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "It's not about Aiden. It's about the way the world is. We don't make the rules, Susan." The conversation ended in a stalemate, both of them feeling the weight of an unspoken truth they couldn't quite express. Neither wanted to admit that their discomfort wasn't entirely about what others thought. It was about confronting their own biases, the ones they hadn't realized were there. Meanwhile, at Aiden's house, things weren't much easier. While Aiden was eager to tell his parents about all the fun he had at Jake's, Marcus and Jada were quietly discussing the situation themselves. "So how was the playdate?" Jada asked as she folded laundry in the living room. Aiden, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his toys scattered around him, smiled brightly. "It was great. Jake has this awesome treehouse and we played dinosaurs all afternoon. He says he wants to come to our house next. Jada smiled, but her eyes darted toward Marcus, who sat reading a book on the couch. She could tell by the way his grip tightened on the pages that he was thinking the same thing she was. "That's nice," sweetie, Jada said, forcing herself to stay positive. "We'll see about having Jake over, okay?" Aiden didn't notice the slight hesitation in her voice. "Okay." Later that night, after Aiden had gone to bed, Jada and Marcus sat together at the kitchen table, their conversation weighed down by the complexities of the situation. What do you think?" Jada asked, breaking the silence. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I think Jake's a good kid, but I don't trust the situation. You saw how Susan looked when we dropped Aiden off. She was polite, but there was something in her eyes like she was uneasy about the whole thing." Jada nodded. "Yeah, I saw it too. I don't think they're bad people, but they're definitely uncomfortable. And that makes me uncomfortable." Marcus ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of years of subtle racism weighing heavily on him. It's always the same thing. People want to act like everything's fine, but then the moment they have to confront their own prejudices, they get scared. And we're the ones who end up paying for it. Jada reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I know, but Aiden doesn't see it that way. He just sees Jake as his friend. I don't want to take that away from him." Marcus squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with concern. "Neither do I. But we have to protect him, Jada. What happens if something goes wrong? What if some other parent or neighbor sees Aiden with Jake and assumes the worst?" Jada's heart sank. She knew Marcus was right, but it didn't make the situation any easier. They both had experienced enough microaggressions and outright racism in their lives to know that even innocent friendships could be torn apart by prejudice. "I guess we'll just have to keep an eye on things," Jada said softly. "We can't stop Aiden from being friends with Jake, but we can be there for him if anything happens." Marcus nodded, though the weight of their decision hung heavily between them. They both knew that this wouldn't be the last time they'd have to navigate the complexities of race and friendship, and the thought left them feeling both weary and determined. The unease between the two families was a microcosm of a larger issue bubbling beneath the surface in their community. A few weeks after Aiden's playdate at Jake's house, the neighborhood association held its monthly meeting. Tom and Susan attended, as they always did, but this time, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that people were whispering behind their backs. As they took their seats, Susan spotted Mrs. Anderson chatting with a few other women near the refreshment table. Mrs. Anderson glanced over at Susan, her eyes flicking away just a little too quickly. Susan's stomach churned with anxiety. The meeting proceeded as usual, with the association president discussing routine issues like neighborhood maintenance and upcoming events. But as the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Anderson stood up and cleared her throat, her voice laced with a carefully concealed edge. "I just wanted to bring up something that's been on my mind," she began, smiling sweetly but with an unmistakable hint of condescension. "I've noticed that we've had some new visitors in the neighborhood lately. You know, kids from other parts of town. And while I'm sure it's all innocent, I think it's important that we keep an eye on who's coming and going." The room fell into an awkward silence, and Susan's heart pounded in her chest. She knew exactly what Mrs. Anderson was implying, and so did everyone else. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. He could feel the judgment in the room, and it made his skin crawl. Another neighbor, Mr. Clark, chimed in. "Yeah, I noticed that too. We just want to make sure our kids are safe, you know. There's been talk of strangers in the area." Susan clenched her fists under the table, her anxiety turning into a slow burning anger. They were talking about Aiden, about a little boy who had done nothing wrong but play with her son. And yet, here they were, cloaking their prejudices and concern for the neighborhood. Tom cleared his throat, his voice steady but tense. "I don't think we need to be making assumptions about people based on where they come from. Jake's made a new friend at school, and that's all this is." Mrs. Anderson smiled, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course, Tom. No one's saying otherwise. We just want to make sure everyone's on the same page, that's all." The meeting ended shortly after, but the tension lingered. As Tom and Susan walked home, neither of them spoke for a long time. The weight of the conversation at the meeting hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "You see, This is exactly what I was worried about. They're already starting to talk. Susan nodded, her eyes downcast. I know, I didn't want to believe it would be an issue, but it's happening. Tom stopped walking, turning to face her. So what do we do? Tell Jake he can't be friends with Aiden anymore. Susan shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know. I don't want to do that, but I don't want him to get hurt either. This isn't fair. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. None of this is fair. But we have to make a decision, Susan. We can't just ignore it and hope it goes away. Susan wiped at her eyes, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had never imagined that her son's friendship with Aiden would lead to this, but here they were, caught between protecting their child and confronting the ugly realities of their community. Back at school, Jake and Aiden were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between their parents. To them, life was simple playtime, shared lunches, and excited conversations about their favorite cartoons. But as time passed, Aiden began to notice small changes that made him feel uneasy. It started with the subtle way some of the other kids looked at him when he and Jake sat together at lunch. They didn't say anything outright, but Aiden could feel their stares, their curiosity tinged with something he couldn't quite name. Whispers followed him in the hallways, though he never knew what they were saying. One afternoon, while they were playing on the playground, a group of boys from their class walked by. One of them, a tall boy named Michael, smirked as he passed. Hey Jake, why are you always hanging out with him? Michael asked, jerking his thumb in Aiden's direction. His tone was mocking, but there was something more than just teasing behind it. Jake frowned, not understanding the insult. What do you mean? Aiden's my friend. Michael shrugged, his smirk widening. Whatever. I just thought you'd hang out with, other people. Aiden felt a strange knot form in his stomach, but he tried to brush it off. He had dealt with comments like this before, even though he hadn't told Jake about them. But this time it hurt more because it was happening in front of his best friend. Jake, however, was oblivious to the deeper meaning behind Michael's words. That's dumb, Jake said firmly, his face scrunching up in confusion. Aiden's awesome. Michael rolled his eyes and walked away, leaving Aiden feeling unsettled. He didn't say anything to Jake about it, but as they continued to play, the incident weighed on his mind. That night, as Aiden lay in bed, he thought about what his parents had told him. They had warned him that some people wouldn't understand, that they might look at him differently just because of the color of his skin. He hadn't wanted to believe them, but now he couldn't ignore the feeling that they were right. As the weeks went by, the divide between Jake and Aiden's families grew more pronounced. Tom and Susan found themselves avoiding conversations about Aiden, while Marcus and Jada kept a close eye on their son's friendship, unsure of what might happen next. One Saturday afternoon, Susan and Jada bumped into each other at the local grocery store. The encounter was awkward, both women unsure of what to say to one another. Hi, Susan, Jada said, her voice friendly but cautious. Hi, Jada, Susan replied, forcing a smile. How's everything? Good. Aiden's been talking about Jake nonstop. He really enjoys spending time with him, Jada said, her eyes searching Susan's face for any sign of discomfort. Susan hesitated, her smile faltering. Yeah, Jake's the same. He loves having Aiden over. There was a pause, both women unsure of how to navigate the unspoken tension between them. Finally, Jada took a deep breath. Look, I know things might be complicated, she began, her voice gentle but firm. But I just want you to know that Aiden's happiness is the most important thing to us. And I hope we can find a way to make this work for the boys. Susan nodded, her heart aching with guilt. I know, I want the same thing, it's just it's hard. People in this town can be well, you know. Jada smiled sadly, understanding all too well. Yeah, I know, but we can't let them dictate our kids' lives, right? Susan swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding. Right. As they parted ways, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than just a friendship between two boys. The world was watching, and sooner or later they would all have to face it. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and Jake was practically bouncing off the walls in excitement. Today, Aiden was coming over for another playdate, and this time they were going to explore Jake's treehouse. Jake had been talking about it nonstop all week, and Aiden was eager to check it out. "Mom, is everything ready?" Jake asked, peeking his head into the kitchen, where Susan was preparing snacks. "Yes," Susan replied with a smile, though there was a tightness in her voice. She glanced out the window, watching for Aiden's arrival. The knot of anxiety in her stomach hadn't gone away, despite her attempts to push it down. Tom sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the newspaper but not really reading it. He, too, was on edge, though he hadn't voiced his concerns to Jake. There was a silent agreement between him and Susan that they wouldn't let their son sense the unease they felt about Aiden's visits. But as the clock ticked closer to Aiden's arrival, the tension in the house was palpable. When the doorbell rang, Jake raced to the door, throwing it open with a grin. "Aiden," Jake shouted, grabbing his friend's arm and pulling him inside. Aiden smiled, looking a little shy but excited. Behind him, Jada stood on the porch, giving Susan a small wave. "Hi, Susan," Jada said as she walked up to the door. "I'll be back to pick Aiden up in a few hours, if that's still okay." "Of course," Susan replied, her smile a little too bright. "The boys will have a great time." Jada nodded, giving Aiden a quick hug before saying goodbye. "Have fun, sweetie. I'll see you later." Once Jada left, Jake pulled Aiden toward the backyard, eager to show him the treehouse. "Come on, you've got to see this." Aiden followed, his eyes widening as they stepped outside. Jake's treehouse was perched high up in an old oak tree, with a sturdy ladder leading up to the entrance. It wasn't huge, but to an 8-year-old, it was an adventure waiting to happen. "Oh, that's awesome," Aiden said, impressed. "Right," Jake beamed. "My dad and I built it together. Come on, let's go up." The boys scrambled up the ladder, laughing as they reached the top. Inside the treehouse, there were blankets, pillows, and a small collection of toys Jake had stashed away. The two boys quickly settled in, making up stories about dinosaurs and astronauts as they played. For a little while, everything felt normal. They were just two kids having fun, unaware of the world outside their bubble. But the world outside wasn't as carefree. A few houses down the street, Mrs. Anderson was trimming the hedges in her front yard when she noticed Aiden climbing into Jake's treehouse. She paused, her pruning shears hovering in the air as she watched the boys. A frown creased her forehead. It wasn't that she had anything against Aiden personally, but she couldn't help but feel uneasy seeing a black boy playing in the neighborhood. It wasn't something she was used to, and her discomfort quickly turned into suspicion. She set her shears down and wiped her hands on her gardening gloves, her eyes narrowing as she continued to watch the boys. What if Aiden wasn't just a playmate? What if he was up to something? Mrs. Anderson had always prided herself on being vigilant, keeping an eye on the neighborhood to ensure it stayed safe, and in her mind this was no different. "I don't like this," she muttered to herself, her gaze fixed on the treehouse. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the neighborhood watch. As she waited for someone to pick up, she glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed what was happening. A man's voice answered on the other end. "Hello, this is Neighborhood Watch. How can I help you?" "Yes, this is Cynthia Anderson from Maple Street," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm calling to report some suspicious activity. There's a boy I don't recognize playing in one of my neighbor's yards. I think someone should come check it out." The man on the other end sounded a little taken aback. Are you sure this is something we need to investigate? It sounds like the boy might just be visiting." "I don't know for sure," Mrs. Anderson replied, her tone insistent. "But I think it's worth checking out. Better safe than sorry, right?" There was a brief pause before the man responded. "Okay, Mom, we'll send someone over to take a look. Thank you for letting us know." Mrs. Anderson hung up the phone, feeling a sense of satisfaction. She had done her part. Now it was up to the neighborhood watch to handle the rest. A short while later, as Jake and Aiden were still playing in the treehouse, the sound of a car pulling up to the house interrupted their game. Jake peeked out the window, confused when he saw two men in uniform stepping out of a black SUV with the Neighborhood Watch logo on the side. "Hey, Aiden, look," Jake said, pointing. "What's going on?" Aiden leaned over, his face scrunching up in confusion. "I don't know. Who are they?" Before the boys could figure out what was happening, the front door opened, and Tom stepped out, looking just as confused as they were. "Can I help you?" Tom asked, walking down the front steps to meet the two men. "Sorry to bother you, sir," one of the men said, glancing up at the treehouse. "We got a call from a concerned neighbor about some unfamiliar activity in your yard." Tom's brow furrowed, his confusion turning into frustration. "Unfamiliar activity? It's just my son and his friend playing in the treehouse. What's the problem?" The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner before responding. "We were told that one of the boys didn't look like he belonged here." Tom's eyes narrowed as the realization of what was happening hit him. His chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You mean my son's black friend?" Tom's voice was sharp, his frustration bubbling over. The man raised his hands defensively. "We're just following up on the call, sir. We didn't mean to imply anything." Tom took a deep breath, trying to control his temper. He didn't want to make a scene in front of Jake or Aiden, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. How could someone in their own neighborhood be so ignorant, so blind to the innocence of two children playing together? Up in the treehouse, Jake and Aiden watched the exchange, their confusion slowly turning into unease. "Jake, do you think they're here because of me?" Aiden asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Jake shook his head, though he wasn't sure of the answer himself. "No way. Why would they be here because of you? That doesn't make sense." But as the conversation continued below, Aiden couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his chest. He had seen this before, adults acting like something was wrong when all he had done was exist in a space they didn't expect him to be in. Tom finally managed to get the neighborhood watch officers to leave, though the tension in his voice made it clear that the incident had rattled him. When he came back inside, Susan was waiting by the door, her face pale. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice shaky. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Apparently Mrs. Anderson called the neighborhood watch because she didn't recognize Aiden and thought he didn't belong here." Susan's eyes widened in shock. "Are you serious?" Tom nodded, his expression grim. "Dead serious. They didn't do anything, but the fact that they even showed up is enough." Susan felt a wave of guilt crash over her. She had been so worried about what people would think, and now her fears had manifested in the worst possible way. She didn't know how to fix this, but she knew they couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. "I'm sorry, Tom," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I should have seen this coming." Tom shook his head. "It's not your fault, Susan. It's this place. This whole town is full of people who don't know how to mind their own business." He glanced out the window, where Jake and Aiden were still in the treehouse, their playful energy now subdued. "We need to talk to Jake about this. He's going to have questions." Later that evening, after Aiden had gone home and the house had settled into an uneasy quiet, Tom and Susan sat down with Jake in the living room. Jake sensed that something was off, but he wasn't sure what it was. All he knew was that the afternoon had taken a strange turn, and now his parents seemed upset. "Jake, we need to talk about what happened today," Tom began, his voice gentle but serious. Jake looked up, frowning. "What do you mean? Wasn't Aiden supposed to come over today?" Tom sighed, glancing at Susan before continuing. "He was, and he did. But something happened that we didn't expect." Susan leaned forward, resting her hand on Jake's shoulder. "Sweetie, do you remember the men who came from the neighborhood watch while you were playing in the treehouse with Aiden?" Jake nodded slowly, his confusion growing. "Yeah, but they didn't do anything. They just talked to Dad and left. What was the big deal?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew this was going to be hard for Jake to understand, but he couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. "The big deal is, Jake someone in our neighborhood called them. They thought something was wrong just because Aiden was here." Jake blinked, his face scrunching up in confusion. "What? But Aiden wasn't doing anything. He's my friend. Why would someone think something was wrong just because he's here?" Susan took a deep breath, her voice soft. "It's because Aiden looks different, Jake. You know that, right? Aiden's black. And sometimes people judge others based on things like that, even if they don't know them. It's not fair, but it happens." Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's stupid. Aiden's the same as me. Why would someone care what he looks like? He's my best friend." Tom rubbed his temples, struggling to explain the complexity of racial prejudice to his young son. You're right, Jake, it is stupid. And it's not fair, but unfortunately not everyone thinks the way you do. Some people have grown up believing that if someone looks different, they don't belong or they might cause trouble. And that's what happened today. Someone thought that because Aiden is black, he didn't belong here. Jake's mouth fell open, and he shook his head in disbelief. But that's not true. Aiden belongs here just as much as I do. We were just playing. Susan smiled sadly, her heart breaking at her son's innocence. I know, sweetie, and you're right. Aiden does belong here. But sometimes it takes people a long time to understand that. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing everything his parents had said. He had never thought about Aiden's skin color before it didn't matter to him. Aiden was just his friend. But now the world felt a little bigger and a lot more unfair. What do I do now? Jake asked, his voice small and uncertain. Tom leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. You keep being Aiden's friend, Jake. You treat him the way you always have, because that's what matters. But you also need to understand that Aiden might face things you won't, just because of the way he looks. And when that happens, you stand by him. You make sure he knows he's not alone. Jake nodded slowly, still trying to wrap his mind around the idea that someone would judge Aiden for something so meaningless. I will, Dad. I'll always stand by Aiden. Susan smiled and reached over to hug Jake. That's what makes you a good friend, Jake, and we're proud of you. Jake hugged his mom back, feeling a little better but still shaken by the day's events. He wasn't sure how to explain what he was feeling, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anyone make Aiden feel like he didn't belong. While Jake was having the difficult conversation with his parents, Aiden was sitting at the dinner table with his own. The ride home had been quiet, and Aiden had sensed that something wasn't right, though he hadn't wanted to bring it up. But as they ate, Aiden finally spoke. Mom, Dad, ... Why did those men come to Jake's house today? Jada and Marcus exchanged a glance. They had been dreading this moment, knowing that sooner or later, Aiden would start to see the world for what it was. They had tried to shield him from it as much as possible, but after today there was no going back. Marcus sighed and set down his fork, looking at Aiden with a mixture of sadness and love. They came because someone in the neighborhood didn't recognize you, Aiden. They didn't think you belonged there. Aiden frowned, confused. But I was just playing with Jake. Why wouldn't they think I belonged? Jada reached over and took Aiden's hand, her voice soft and steady. Because sometimes people make judgments about others based on how they look. You're black, Aiden, and to some people, that's all they see. They don't see you for who you are, they only see your skin. Aiden stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and hurt. That's not fair. I didn't do anything wrong. I know, baby, Jada said, her heart aching. It's not fair. And it's not right, but it happens, and it's something you might have to face as you get older. Aiden's lip trembled, but he tried to hold back his tears. He didn't want to cry, but the weight of the world felt so heavy on his small shoulders. I just want to be friends with Jake. I don't want people to be mad at me. Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm but filled with love. Aiden, listen to me. You didn't do anything wrong. You have every right to be friends with Jake and to play with him in his yard, just like any other kid. But sometimes people are going to try to make you feel like you don't belong. And when that happens, you need to remember that you do belong. You belong anywhere you want to be. Aiden sniffled and nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. Okay, Dad? Jada smiled sadly, brushing a tear from Aiden's cheek. And no matter what happens, you're not alone. You have us and you have Jake, and you have a right to be proud of who you are. Aiden managed a small smile, feeling a little better knowing his parents were there for him. But deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the world was suddenly more complicated than he had realized. Later that night, after Aiden had gone to bed, Marcus and Jada sat together in the living room, the weight of the day's events hanging over them like a dark cloud. I knew this was going to happen eventually, Marcus said, his voice filled with frustration and sadness. I just didn't think it would happen so soon. Jada sighed, leaning back on the couch. I know. He's just a kid. He shouldn't have to deal with this already. Marcus clenched his fists, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. It's not fair. He was just playing with his friend, and someone decided to turn it into something ugly. Jada placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but steady. I hate it too, Marcus. But we can't change the world overnight. All we can do is prepare Aiden for what he might face and make sure he knows we're always here for him. Marcus nodded, though the pain in his heart didn't ease. I just wish he didn't have to go through this at all. Jada smiled sadly, leaning her head on his shoulder. Me too, but we'll get through it, and Aiden will be stronger for it. They sat together in silence for a while, both of them lost in their thoughts. They knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, not for them, and certainly not for Aiden, but they were determined to face it together no matter what. The weekend after the neighborhood watch incident had left a thick tension in the air for both families. In Jake's household, the unease wasn't just about the awkward encounter, it was about what it revealed, not only about their neighbors but about themselves. Sunday morning was quiet. Tom sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, his brows knit together in thought. Across from him, Susan stirred her tea absent-mindedly, staring out the window as if the answers to her questions were somewhere out in the yard. What are we going to do about this? Susan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a weariness to her tone, one that reflected not just a concern for Jake but a deeper realization about the world they lived in. Tom sighed, setting his coffee mug down with a soft thud. I don't know, Susan. I just don't know. He ran his hand over his face, as if trying to rub away the frustration and confusion that had settled there since the day before. I hate that we didn't see this coming, Susan said, her voice trembling slightly. I mean, I knew this town could be closed-minded at times, but I never thought it would impact Jake like this. Tom nodded slowly. We've always been the kind of people who thought we were doing the right thing by just being good people, by not treating people differently because of their race. But maybe maybe that's not enough. Maybe we've been turning a blind eye to the real issues. Susan looked down at her tea, her fingers tightening around the cup. I didn't want Jake to grow up thinking about race all the time. I thought if we didn't make it an issue, then it wouldn't be one for him. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe we've been pretending that racism is something far away, something that doesn't touch us here. Tom frowned, leaning back in his chair. It's easier to believe that when it doesn't affect us directly. But now now it's right in our face. And it's not just about Jake, it's about Aiden too. He's the one who had to deal with this, and we didn't do anything to prepare him or Jake for that. There was a long silence between them as they both wrestled with their thoughts. The realization that they had failed to acknowledge the complexities of race and friendship was heavy on their hearts. I think we need to have a real conversation with Jake, Susan said finally, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Not just about what happened, but about what it means. We need to teach him to see what's happening, not just to him, but to Aiden too. Tom nodded in agreement. You're right, but it's not going to be easy. We've been raising him in a world we wanted to believe was better than this. But the truth is, it's not, and we need to face that. Meanwhile, Jake was sitting on the floor of his room, flipping through a dinosaur book absent-mindedly. He couldn't stop thinking about Aiden and the weird looks he'd gotten from the neighborhood watch men. Jake didn't understand why they had come in the first place. Aiden wasn't any different from the other friends he'd had before. But for some reason, the adults were acting like there was something wrong. Jake frowned, putting his book down and picking up a small dinosaur figurine. As he stared at it, his mind kept replaying the events of the day before. He remembered the way Aiden's face had fallen when the men showed up. Aiden had seemed confused at first, just like Jake, but then he had gotten quiet, like he understood something Jake didn't. His mom and dad had tried to explain it to him the night before, but Jake still didn't fully get it. Why did people care what Aiden looked like? They were both kids, they liked the same things, they played the same games. Why did it matter? Feeling restless, Jake got up and wandered into the living room, where his parents were still sitting at the kitchen table. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them in silence before finally speaking. Mom? Dad? Tom looked up, surprised to see Jake there. Hey, buddy, what's up? Jake walked over and sat down at the table, his legs swinging nervously under the chair. I've been thinking about what happened with Aiden. I still don't understand why the neighborhood watch came. Why did they care about him being here? Susan glanced at Tom, then turned to Jake with a soft sigh. It's because Aiden is black, Jake. People sometimes make judgments about others based on the color of their skin. They think that if someone looks different, they don't belong. Jake frowned, his small hands curling into fists on the table. But that's dumb. Aiden's my friend. Why would they think he doesn't belong? Tom leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You're right, Jake, it is dumb. But unfortunately, it's something a lot of people believe, even if they don't realize it. They've been taught to be afraid of people who are different from them. Jake stared at the table, his mind racing. But why didn't you tell me about this before? Susan swallowed, her heart aching. We didn't want you to have to think about things like this. We wanted you to see people for who they are, not for how they look. But now we realize that pretending these things don't exist doesn't make them go away. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what his parents were saying. What do I do now? Tom smiled sadly. You keep being Aiden's friend. You keep treating him the way you always have. But you also need to understand that he might face things that you won't, just because of the way he looks. And when that happens, you stand by him. You let him know he's not alone. Jake nodded slowly, though the weight of his parents' words was heavy on his small shoulders. Okay, I will. Susan reached out and gently ruffled his hair. We're proud of you, Jake. Being a good friend means standing up for each other, even when things get tough. Jake smiled weakly, feeling a little better but still unsettled by the conversation. He didn't want Aiden to feel like he didn't belong, and he was determined to make sure that never happened again. At Aiden's house, things were similarly tense. Aiden hadn't said much since the playdate, but Jada and Marcus could tell that something was weighing on him. They had hoped to protect him from the ugliness of the world for a little longer, but after what had happened, there was no going back. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Aiden finally spoke up. Mom, Dad, why do people care what color I am? Jada froze, her heart sinking at the question she had been dreading. She glanced at Marcus, who sighed heavily before putting down his fork. Because, Aiden, Marcus began, his voice steady but pained, some people have been taught to fear things that are different from them. They think that if someone doesn't look like them, they don't belong. Aiden's brow furrowed, his small hands fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. But I didn't do anything wrong. I was just playing with Jake. Why would they think I don't belong? Jada reached over and placed her hand over Aiden's, her voice soft but firm. You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. And you do belong everywhere. But the world isn't always fair. People make judgments based on things that don't matter, like the color of your skin. And that's why we have to be strong. We have to show them that we belong, no matter what they think. Aiden looked up at her, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. I just want to be friends with Jake. I don't want people to be mad at me. Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Aiden, being friends with Jake is a good thing. You shouldn't have to worry about what other people think. But sometimes people will try to make you feel like you don't belong just because you're different. And when that happens, you need to remember that you have every right to be there, just as much as anyone else. Aiden nodded slowly, though the weight of his father's words was heavy on his heart. Okay, Dad? Jada smiled, though her heart ached for her son. She had hoped he wouldn't have to face these kinds of questions so soon, but now that he had, she knew they had to prepare him for the world he was growing up in. We're always here for you, Aiden, Jada said softly. No matter what happens, you're never alone, and you should always be proud of who you are. Aiden smiled weakly, though the hurt in his eyes hadn't gone away. I will, Mom. In the days that followed, both families wrestled with the aftermath of the incident. For Tom and Susan, the challenge was figuring out how to navigate their own biases and the prejudices of their community. For Marcus and Jada, it was about protecting Aiden while helping him understand the complexities of race and identity. But despite the tension, the boys' friendship remained strong. Jake and Aiden continued to play together at school, their bond untouched by the events that had shaken their parents. One afternoon, while picking Jake up from school, Susan spotted Jada waiting for Aiden outside the school gates. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether to approach her. But then, she took a deep breath and walked over. Susan called softly, offering a tentative smile as she approached. Jada turned, her expression neutral but not unkind. Susan. There was a moment of awkward silence between them before Susan spoke again. I just wanted to say ... I'm really sorry about what happened. I had no idea that something like that would happen in our neighborhood, and it's been ... eye-opening, to say the least. Jada nodded slowly, her expression softening. It's not your fault, Susan. But I appreciate you saying that. This isn't the first time we've dealt with something like this, and it probably won't be the last. But it's hard when it affects the kids. Susan's eyes welled with tears as she nodded in agreement. I know. I just ... I feel like I failed Jake by not preparing him for the reality of the world. He had no idea why what happened was wrong, and that's on us. Jada smiled gently, reaching out to place a hand on Susan's arm. It's not easy raising kids in a world like this. But the fact that you're willing to face it now and talk to Jake about it, that's what matters. We can't change the world overnight, but we can teach our kids to do better. Susan smiled through her tears, grateful for Jada's kindness. Thank you. I promise we're going to do better. Jada nodded, her smile warm. That's all we can do. As the school bell rang and the kids came pouring out, both women stood together, watching as Jake and Aiden ran toward them, laughing and talking as if nothing had ever changed. And in that moment, they realized that while the world around them was flawed, their children still had the chance to build something better. What happened between Jake and Aiden at the playdate might have stayed confined to the two families and a few nosy neighbors, but in the digital age, things rarely remain private. A few days after the incident, someone in the neighborhood posted about it in the local community's Facebook group. The post started innocuously enough. Mrs. Anderson, the original caller, recounted how she had seen a suspicious boy in someone's yard and had called the neighborhood watch out of concern. Most people initially agreed with her, chiming in with comments about how they were just looking out for each other, but soon the post took a different turn. A few residents began questioning why Mrs. Anderson had felt the need to call in the first place, especially since the boy was Jake's friend. More people started to speak up, mentioning the boy's race as a probable factor. The conversation quickly escalated, with half of the group defending Mrs. Anderson's actions, and the other half accusing her of racial profiling. Within a matter of days, the post had blown up. Screenshots of the conversation were shared on Twitter and Instagram, and what had started as a local debate became a citywide and then regional issue. Social media users from outside the neighborhood began commenting on the situation, and the community of Maple Street found itself at the center of a growing conversation about race, privilege, and bias. Jake and Aiden had no idea about the online firestorm that was brewing, but their parents weren't as lucky. Tom and Susan started getting messages from neighbors asking about what had really happened, and Marcus and Jada began receiving concerned phone calls from friends who had seen the post online. One evening, as Tom sat scrolling through his phone, he sighed heavily and looked over at Susan, who was putting away the dishes. You should see this, Tom muttered, his face tight with frustration. Susan glanced at him, drying her hands on a towel. What now? Tom held up his phone, showing her the latest comments on the Facebook post. This whole thing has spiraled out of control. It's like everyone in the city knows about it now. People are making accusations, taking sides. It's ridiculous. Susan leaned over to look at the screen, her heart sinking as she read the comments. People who didn't even know their family or Aiden's were making assumptions about what had happened, and the conversation had become a battleground for people's opinions on race and safety in the suburbs. This is getting out of hand, Susan said softly, her voice shaking with frustration. I never wanted this to turn into some kind of public spectacle. Tom shook his head, his fingers tapping the edge of the table in agitation. Neither did I, but now we're stuck in the middle of it. We're the family with the suspicious black kid in our yard, and everyone has something to say about it. Susan sat down at the table, rubbing her temples. We have to figure out how to handle this, Tom. We can't just let people keep talking without addressing it. Tom sighed. What are we supposed to do? Go on social media and argue with a bunch of strangers? I'm not sure that's going to help. Susan thought for a moment, then said, maybe we need to talk to the people who really matter, the people in our community at school. We should explain what happened and why it was wrong. If we stay silent, we're just letting other people control the narrative. Tom nodded slowly, considering her words. You're right. But we can't do this alone. We need Marcus and Jada to be part of this conversation too. The next day, Tom and Susan called Marcus and Jada, asking if they could come over to discuss the situation. The two couples hadn't spent much time together since the playdate, each dealing with the fallout in their own way, but it was clear that now, more than ever, they needed to be on the same page. That evening, Marcus and Jada arrived at the Porter's house, the tension between the families palpable. They sat around the living room, the silence heavy as they all tried to find the right words to begin. "I'm glad you guys could come over," Tom said after a moment, breaking the silence. "I know things have been tense lately, and we wanted to talk to you about what's been happening, especially with everything blowing up online." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, we've seen the posts. People are turning this whole thing into something bigger than it was. But the fact that it's gotten this far, it says a lot about the world we're living in." Jada sighed, leaning back in her chair. "This isn't just about Aiden and Jake anymore. This is about how people see race, even in a supposedly progressive community like this one. It's ugly, and it's exhausting." Susan glanced down at her hands, feeling a wave of guilt wash over her. "I'm sorry, we never meant for any of this to happen. We just wanted our kids to be friends without all of this baggage. But now it feels like the whole world is watching, and I don't know how to fix it." Marcus looked at her, his expression softening. "Susan, it's not your fault. But the fact that this is happening, well, it's just a reminder that we can't pretend race doesn't matter. It does. And it's something we're going to have to face, whether we like it or not." Tom nodded, his jaw tight with frustration. "We've been getting messages from people asking about what happened, and we don't know how to respond. We don't want to make it worse, but we also don't want people thinking what happened was okay." Jada leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "I think the best thing we can do is be honest. We need to tell people what really happened, and we need to make it clear that what Mrs. Anderson did calling the neighborhood watch because Aiden was in your yard, that wasn't just an overreaction. It was racial profiling. Plain and simple." Tom and Susan exchanged a glance, both of them nodding slowly. "You're right," Tom said. "We've been tiptoeing around this because we didn't want to make waves. But maybe it's time we stopped worrying about what other people think and start standing up for what's right." Marcus smiled faintly. "Welcome to the club." The following week, the fallout from the social media post had made its way to the school administration. The principal, Mrs. Alvarez, called both families into the school for a meeting to discuss the situation, as other parents had begun expressing concerns about how the incident might affect their own children. When Tom, Susan, Marcus, and Jada arrived at the school, they were led into a conference room where Mrs. Alvarez and a few other members of the school board were waiting. The tension in the room was thick as they all sat down, unsure of how the meeting would unfold. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Alvarez began, her voice calm but serious. "As you know, there's been quite a bit of talk about the incident involving Jake and Aiden, and it's become a point of discussion not just here at school, but within the community. We wanted to have this meeting to ensure that we're all on the same page and to discuss how we can move forward in a way that's best for both boys." Tom glanced at Susan, then at Marcus and Jada. "We appreciate that, Mrs. Alvarez. We've been trying to figure out how to handle this ourselves. It's been a lot." Jada nodded in agreement. "This situation has gotten bigger than we expected, and we're concerned about the impact it's having on Aiden and Jake. We want to make sure they're supported, but we also want to make it clear that what happened wasn't okay." Mrs. Alvarez leaned forward, her expression empathetic. "I completely understand. We've received feedback from some parents who are concerned about the situation, and while most of them want to ensure that the school remains a safe and inclusive environment, there are some who well, let's just say they're less open-minded." Tom clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up. "So what do we do about it? We can't let those parents dictate how our kids live their lives." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Exactly. The last thing we want is for Aiden and Jake to feel like they have to hide their friendship just because some people don't get it." Mrs. Alvarez smiled warmly. "I agree, and I want you to know that the school is fully supportive of Aiden and Jake's friendship. We're committed to making sure they feel safe and accepted here. That being said, we also believe it's important to address this issue head-on. We're planning to hold a community meeting to discuss what happened, and we'd like to invite you both to speak." Susan's eyes widened in surprise. "US? Speak at the meeting." Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "Yes, I think it would be helpful for the community to hear from both families about what happened and why it's important to confront issues like racial profiling. This is an opportunity to educate people and to create a dialogue about how we can make our community more inclusive." Jada looked over at Marcus, who nodded in agreement. "I think that's a good idea. It's not going to be easy, but we need to have this conversation." Tom nodded as well, his voice resolute. "We're in. It's time we start speaking up." The night of the community meeting, the school auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and students. The air was thick with anticipation as people filed into their seats, murmurs of conversation filling the room. Some were there out of genuine concern, hoping to learn and engage in the dialogue about race and bias. Others were there to defend the status quo, uncomfortable with the idea that their neighborhood wasn't as inclusive as they thought. Tom and Susan sat in the front row, their nerves buzzing. Behind them, Marcus and Jada sat quietly, their faces calm but serious. They had spent the past week preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of what they were about to do felt overwhelming. Mrs. Alvarez stood at the front of the auditorium, welcoming everyone and thanking them for coming. After a few opening remarks, she introduced the two families. "As many of you know, there was an incident recently involving two of our students, Jake and Aiden, and it has sparked an important conversation about race, bias, and community tonight. We have the opportunity to hear from their families and to engage in an open and honest dialogue about these issues. I encourage you all to listen with open hearts and minds." Tom stood first, his hands trembling slightly as he walked to the front of the room. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm not going to lie, this isn't an easy thing to talk about. My family has lived in this community for a while, and we've always thought of it as a safe, welcoming place. But what happened with Aiden and Jake ... well, it's made us realize that maybe we haven't been paying attention to everything that's going on around us." He paused, glancing back at Susan for support. "We didn't realize how much bias still exists in our community until it affected us directly. When someone called the neighborhood watch because Aiden was playing with Jake in our yard, it wasn't just an innocent mistake, it was racial profiling. And that's something we need to address. Not just as a family, but as a community." Marcus stepped up next, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "For my family, this isn't new. We've dealt with situations like this before. And we've learned how to navigate them. But that doesn't make it any easier. Aiden shouldn't have to feel like he doesn't belong just because of the color of his skin. And Jake shouldn't have to wonder why people are treating his best friend differently. We're here tonight because we believe that. This community can do better." The room was silent as the two families spoke, their words hanging in the air like a challenge. The crowd shifted uneasily, some parents nodding in agreement, while others avoided eye contact. When the families finished speaking, Mrs. Alvarez opened the floor for questions and comments. What followed was a tense but productive discussion about race, privilege, and the steps the community could take to ensure that something like this didn't happen again. By the end of the night, it was clear that not everyone in the room was ready to confront their own biases, but for the first time the conversation had begun, and that, in itself, was a victory. The night of the community meeting was emotionally charged, but once it was over, the neighborhood was left to deal with the fallout. Some families walked away feeling enlightened, ready to reevaluate their biases and work towards building a more inclusive community. Others left feeling defensive, clinging to their beliefs, and frustrated that their quiet suburban life had been disrupted by conversations about race and privilege. For the Porter and Johnson families, the meeting was a significant step forward, but it wasn't the end of the journey. Tom, Susan, Marcus, and Jada had stood together in front of the community, exposing their vulnerabilities, and now they were left to navigate the complex emotions that had followed. The days after the meeting were filled with cautious optimism, but there was still tension in the air. Some neighbors had reached out, expressing support for what the families had said, while others remained distant, uncomfortable with the direction things had taken. Jake and Aiden, however, were blissfully unaware of the adult complexities surrounding their friendship. For them, life had returned to normal, or at least something resembling normal. They still spent time together at school, played video games at each other's houses, and laughed about their shared love of dinosaurs. But there was an unspoken understanding between them now, one that neither boy fully grasped, but that had settled into the rhythm of their friendship. One Saturday morning, a week after the meeting, Jake invited Aiden over to his house again. Susan and Tom were hesitant at first, wondering if they were ready to face any lingering judgment from the neighborhood. But in the end, they decided that they couldn't let fear dictate their actions. When Aiden arrived, the boys immediately ran out to the backyard, climbing into Jake's treehouse like they always did. From the kitchen window, Susan watched them with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She knew things weren't entirely back to normal, but seeing the boys play without a care in the world reminded her that some things at least were still as they should be. "They're resilient," Tom said, walking up behind her and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Kids are a lot stronger than we give them credit for." Susan nodded, leaning into him. "I know. I just worry about what might happen the next time someone decides to judge Aiden. I don't want Jake to have to keep learning these hard lessons, but I know we can't protect him from everything." Tom sighed. "No, we can't. But we can keep teaching him the right lessons. We can make sure he knows how to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Susan smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride for her son. "He's a good kid, Tom. I think he's already learned more than we ever did at his age." Tom nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and he's going to be better for it." While the boys played in the backyard, Marcus and Jada sat in their living room, enjoying a rare quiet moment. The community meeting had stirred up a lot of emotions, and while they were grateful for the support they had received, there was still a lingering heaviness in their hearts. "I keep thinking about the meeting," Jada said, breaking the silence. "I'm glad we spoke up, but part of me wonders if anything really changed. Do you think people will actually take what we said to heart?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "Some will. I saw it in their faces. Some people were listening. But others," he trailed off, shaking his head. "There's always going to be resistance. Some people just don't want to face the reality of their own biases. It's too uncomfortable." Jada sighed, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and sadness. "I hate that Aiden has to grow up dealing with this. I want him to be proud of who he is, but I also want him to be prepared for what he might face. It's such a delicate balance." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It is. But I think we're doing the best we can. Aiden's smart. He's starting to understand that the world isn't always fair. But he also knows that he has us, and he has Jake. That's something." As if on cue, the phone rang, and Jada reached over to pick it up. It was Aiden, calling from Jake's house. "Hey, baby," Jada said, her voice warm. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, Mom, everything's fine," Aiden replied, his voice slightly hesitant. "I just wanted to ask you something." Jada's brow furrowed slightly. "What is it?" "Well, Jake was talking about this other boy at school, Michael. And Jake said that Michael doesn't really want to hang out with us anymore. He said Michael thinks it's weird that Jake and I are friends. Why does he think that?" Jada's heart sank. She had been dreading this moment, the moment when Aiden would start asking the harder questions, the ones she didn't always have the answers to. She glanced at Marcus, who had been listening, and took a deep breath before answering. "Aiden, honey, sometimes people have ideas about who should be friends with who, and those ideas come from things they've been taught, things that aren't right, but they've been told for a long time." "So, Michael doesn't like me because I'm black?" Aiden asked, his voice quiet. Jada felt a lump form in her throat. "It's possible. But remember, Aiden, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with being black or being different from someone else. If Michael can't see that, then that's his problem, not yours." Aiden was silent for a moment, and Jada could almost hear the wheels turning in his young mind. But what if Jake starts thinking like that too? Jada's heart ached at the fear in her son's voice. "I don't think Jake will, baby. Jake's your friend because he likes you for who you are. You've been through a lot together, and that kind of friendship is strong. But if something ever changes, you come talk to us, okay? We're always here for you." "Okay, Mom," Aiden replied softly. "Thanks." After they hung up, Jada sat in silence for a few moments, her emotions swirling. Marcus reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "He's asking the right questions," Marcus said quietly. and he's lucky to have us to help him find the answers." Jada smiled faintly, though her heart still felt heavy. "I just hope we can keep guiding him through this without letting it break him." Marcus's eyes darkened with determination. "We will. We won't let it break him." As the weeks passed, the community meeting began to fade from the forefront of people's minds, but the school administration was determined to keep the conversation going. Mrs. Alvarez, the principal, reached out to both the Porter and Johnson families, inviting them to help shape a new initiative aimed at addressing diversity, inclusion, and bias in the school. Tom and Susan were initially hesitant, unsure if they were equipped to take on such a role, but after talking it over with Marcus and Jada, they realized how important it was to be part of the solution. At the first meeting of the new initiative, Mrs. Alvarez welcomed them into the school's conference room, where a few teachers and administrators had already gathered. "Thank you all for being here," Mrs. Alvarez began, her voice warm but serious. "We've seen how the recent incident has sparked a lot of important conversations in our community, and we believe it's time to make those conversations part of the fabric of our school's culture. We want to create a space where every student feels safe, valued, and seen, and that's why we've brought you here today to help us figure out how to do that." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I think the first step is acknowledging that these issues exist even in a community like ours. We can't pretend that because we live in a nice neighborhood or because our kids go to a good school that we're immune to racism or bias." Susan spoke up next, her voice quiet but determined. "I agree. I think a lot of us have been living in a bubble, thinking that if we just ignore these problems they'll go away, but they won't. And our kids are going to be the ones who suffer if we don't start addressing them now." Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her expression serious. "Exactly. And we want to give our students the tools to understand and combat these issues. We're planning to introduce a series of workshops and discussions, starting with the older students to talk about race, identity, and privilege. But we also want to involve the parents, because this is something that affects the entire community." Jada leaned forward, her eyes filled with determination. "It's not going to be easy. There are going to be people who push back, who don't want to have these conversations, but we need to keep pushing. Our kids deserve better than the world we grew up in." The group spent the next hour discussing ideas for the initiative, brainstorming ways to create a more inclusive environment for all students. By the end of the meeting, there was a renewed sense of hope, a feeling that, despite the challenges ahead, they were taking the first steps toward real change. One sunny afternoon, Jake and Aiden met up again for a playdate, this time at Aiden's house. Jada had prepared snacks for the boys, who were eagerly planning their next game. But before they disappeared into the backyard, Jake turned to Aiden with a serious look in his eyes. "Hey, Aiden, I wanted to ask you something," Jake said, his voice uncertain. Aiden looked at him curiously. "What is it?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the ground. "Well, remember when Michael said that stuff at school? About it being weird that we're friends?" Aiden nodded slowly, his stomach tightening at the memory. "Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, I don't care what Michael thinks," Jake said firmly. "You're my best friend, and I don't care if people think it's weird. I don't care if people think we're different. I'm always going to be your friend." Aiden's face broke into a wide smile, relief flooding through him. "Thanks, Jake. I'm always going to be your friend, too." The boys exchanged a quick hug, an act that, for them, was as simple and natural as breathing. It was a moment of quiet solidarity, a promise that, no matter what the world threw at them, they would face it together. As they ran off to play, Jada watched from the kitchen window, her heart swelling with pride. She knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for now she was content knowing that her son had a friend who would stand by his side no matter what. In the months that followed, the initiative at the school began to take shape, and the community slowly started to heal. The conversation sparked by the incident at the Porter house had forced people to confront their own biases and to engage with issues they had long ignored. It hadn't been easy, and there were still plenty of people who resisted the changes, but for the first time it felt like progress was being made. Jake and Aiden's friendship continued to grow, and as the boys navigated the ups and downs of childhood, their bond remained unshaken. They were each other's safe haven, a reminder that, despite the complexities of the world, some things like friendship could remain simple and true. For their parents, the journey was far from over. Tom, Susan, Marcus, and Jada continued to work together, determined to make sure that their children grew up in a world where they didn't have to fear being judged for the color of their skin. They knew they couldn't change everything, but they were committed to making a difference in their corner of the world. And in the end, that was what mattered most.